There's something strange about being a chosen one and being older. Younger souls keep finding their way into your orbit, drawn by something they can't name. It doesn't announce itself. There's no signal, no invitation. You just notice one day that they are watching you. Not staring at your face, not clocking your age. Caught by a stillness they've never encountered anywhere else. That's the wonder at the center of this. Younger souls live inside a flood, a constant wash of curated light, synthetic voices, nervous systems soaked in stimulation with almost no silence to process any of it. Their inner worlds are under a kind of siege they can't name because they've never known anything different. And then they walk into a room where you're present, not performing, not reaching, just anchored. And something in their entire body registers it before their mind has words for what it found. The nervous system picks up the frequency first. The mind catches up later, if it ever does. That's what they're responding to. Not your face, the coherence, the quiet, unshakable steadiness of someone who has walked through fire and come out the other side, not bitter but still standing. It's not flattery, it's closer to physics. One presence broadcasting stillness into a room full of scattered signals, and every scattered signal unconsciously orienting toward the only fixed point in the space. And that's where the story you were handed starts to fall apart. You were told the attention was about years, some biological signal, some cultural script about desirability mapped to numbers. But that explanation takes something three-dimensional and flattens it into something small enough to dismiss. It's been costing you clarity. What's actually happening is a much deeper exchange. The kind of presence you're being called into doesn't lean forward to be understood. It doesn't chase. It doesn't prove. It simply stands. And the standing is what draws them in. That's what coherence does. It broadcasts without speaking. Pause, but this dynamic reaches backward, not just forward. And that's where the story gets wider, closer to the root. You've been carrying something that didn't start with you, not metaphorically, literally, generationally. A sensitivity passed down through blood and breath and the unspoken architecture of a household, a restlessness for the unseen. A way of knowing things before anyone tells you. Reading a room like a text. Feeling the emotional weather shift before anyone opens their mouth. You've been told this is too much, that you're too intense. That you need to dial it back, lighten up, stop overthinking. But that sensitivity isn't a flaw, it's an inheritance. If you trace it back, really trace it, through a parent, through a grandparent, through the aunt who always seemed to know something was wrong before the phone rang, the thread is there. Someone in that lineage carried the same frequency. They may never have had language for it. They may have buried it under religiosity, or silence, or the sheer weight of surviving. But it was present, and it landed here. In you. That's the part nobody names. When a perceptual sensitivity passes through generations that don't understand it, it gets treated as a condition to manage rather than a faculty to use. The teaching was never how to read the patterns. It was how to apologize for seeing them, how to shrink the seeing, how to pretend the registration wasn't happening because the registration made other people uncomfortable. That lesson was learned so thoroughly it became automatic, the perception dimming before there was even awareness of the dimming. Something sits quietly unanswered beneath all of this. Beneath every family photograph, every half-remembered story told at a funeral. What happens when an entire lineage carries equipment it never learned to name? And what might that equipment have been for all along? Because the inheritance arrives as something specific. That generational sensitivity, the capacity to feel what others can't feel, to sense the frequency underneath the surface, to read the unspoken dynamics of a room before a single word is spoken. That's not excess wiring, it's a perceptual technology, passed through the bloodline for a reason. I spent 20 years studying the languages people have used to describe what can't quite be said. Ancient tongues, ritual frameworks, indigenous epistemologies that Western institutions spent 12 years training their students to dismiss. And through all of it, I was really searching for one thing: permission to trust an inheritance that had been taught into suppression. I wanted a citation, an academic framework, someone with authority to confirm what my bones already knew, that what I was carrying was real, functional, testable. I remember sitting in a lecture hall at the University of Edinburgh midway through a seminar on indigenous knowledge frameworks, surrounded by 23 students trained to dismiss the very thing being discussed, and somewhere in that room, I caught myself doing it again, apologizing, building a case, negotiating for space inside a structure that was never designed to validate what I was carrying. That moment broke something, not dramatically, not with a scene, though the resignation letter came later. It broke something quiet. A habit, the habit of waiting for external permission to trust an internal inheritance. What changes when the apology stops isn't that the world suddenly understands. It doesn't. What changes is that the energy stops leaking into the project of explaining. The preemptive shrinking, making yourself smaller so others won't be unsettled by what you perceive. That expenditure just ceases. And when it ceases, when the apology finally goes quiet, the inheritance finds an open channel. That's when the magnetism shifts. The frequency younger souls detect isn't age. It's not authority in any conventional sense. It's coherence, what happens when someone has stopped fighting their own equipment. When the apology stops, the signal clarifies, and those who are starving for something real, drowning in synthetic personas and algorithmic mirrors, register that coherence the way you register a lighthouse from open water. They don't always know why they're drawn, but something in them recognizes something the world has been systematically training out of everyone. That moment broke something, not dramatically, not with a protest or a raised voice, though the resignation letter did come later. It broke something quiet. A habit, the habit of reaching outside yourself for permission to claim what was already yours. What changes when the apology stops isn't that the world suddenly understands. It doesn't. What changes is that the energy stops bleeding into the work of explaining yourself. The constant preemptive shrinking, making yourself smaller so other people can stay comfortable, that stops. And when it stops, when the apology finally goes quiet, something that was always there finds room to move. A channel clears. And just beyond that, something even older waits. That's when the magnetism shifts. What younger souls pick up on isn't age. It's not authority in the way most people mean it. It's coherence, what happens when someone has finally stopped fighting their own nature. When the apology stops, the signal gets clean. And the people who are starving for something real, drowning in curated personas and algorithmic noise, they register that like a lighthouse in the dark. They don't always know why they're drawn, but something in them knows something the world has been quietly training out of everyone for a long time. There's a contradiction to sit with, though, and I'm leaving it unfinished here on purpose, because what comes next, the actual cost of carrying this, the part most conversations on this topic never go near, it's going to feel like the opposite of everything just said. The cost isn't suffering, it isn't rejection, it's visibility. Being seen clearly, accurately, by people who register the signal before you've finished doubting yourself. Say with this, nothing is being softened, just want the ears ready before we go further. The signs have been read wrong. That needs to be named before we go anywhere else, because the pattern is both simpler and harder than what most people are handed. And missing it means missing the whole shape of what's actually unfolding. This isn't random attention. Random attention is flimsy. It dissolves the moment something shinier walks into the room. What's happening here is something different. magnetic, sustained. The kind of fixation that seems to bypass normal social instinct because it isn't working through normal social instinct. It's running on a recognition that most frameworks don't have words for, so the signs come in pairs. Not a checklist. More like two sides of the same thing held up to different light, the wound and the purpose, because they almost always are the same thing, just seen from different angles. Invisibility in a room full of your peers, and at the same time, being intensely watched by someone who has no obvious reason to be watching. That's the first pair. The invisibility isn't rejection, it's a frequency mismatch. When someone has settled into a kind of coherence that most people around them haven't reached yet or have actively buried, the result is a strange quiet, no registration on the same channel. Like speaking a language no one in the room is fluent in. Nothing lands, and that's painful. It feels like irrelevance. It feels like being out of season, out of sync, out of place. The isolation isn't a punishment. It's just what happens when a signal has refined itself past the bandwidth of ambient social noise. And the being seen, that intensity from unexpected eyes, isn't flattery. It's the same refinement landing on a receiver that can actually detect it. Two sides of one thing. The stillness that makes you invisible to the crowd is the exact same stillness that pulls certain people out of orbit and toward you. Neither experience is being manufactured. Neither is being sought. Both arrive on their own, and both point toward the same thing. The frequency is real, and it's running whether or not you're paying attention to it. What lingers, unfinished, is the question of what happens when you stop mistaking the invisibility for absence and the visibility for threat. What happens when neither side of the pair gets resisted, when both are just allowed to be evidence of a transmission that was never really personal to begin with. And just beyond that, something older still, and then the younger ones look. Not because you're doing anything, you're not performing at all, but because their nervous systems, still raw and open and unarmored by years of accumulated numbness, can feel the coherence you've become. They're not drawn to you in spite of your stillness. They're drawn to you because of it. The invisibility and the visibility are the same signal, just hitting different receivers. You feel overlooked by systems and institutions, passed over for things that were supposedly built for someone with your experience, and yet a stranger across a coffee shop holds your gaze longer than makes sense. That's the second pair. Systems are built to reward conformity, not coherence. If you've spent years refusing to perform, refusing the office politics, the self-promotion, the low-grade compromise that most institutions quietly require, the system genuinely doesn't have a category for you. It doesn't know what to do with someone who stopped negotiating. So it looks past you, but the individual soul, the one who hasn't been fully absorbed by those systems yet, registers you as a presence. As something worth stopping for. That eye contact isn't flirtation. It isn't curiosity, exactly. It's something more cellular than that. Some part of them is reaching toward you without asking permission from the conscious mind, trying to absorb whatever it is that made you this still. You feel obsolete in one room and magnetic in another because those rooms aren't measuring the same thing. One is counting output. The other is sensing presence. You feel the weight of years of healing, the grief, the long stretches of isolation, the nights when no one called and no one would have understood anyway, and then suddenly there's an influx of attention that seems to want something you can't quite name. That's the third pair. The cost is real. You've walked through things most people spend their lives finding ways around. The inherited wounds, the patterns that go back further than you, the cycles that most people die without ever looking directly at. And that work is invisible. It happens in private, in the small hours, in rooms where nobody applauds, There's a particular ache in being passed over by systems while strangers stop and hold your gaze across a crowded room. That's the second pair. Systems are built to reward conformity, not coherence. If you've spent decades refusing to run on the frequencies most institutions demand, the politics, the performance, the endless self-presentation, the system genuinely doesn't know what to do with you. It has no category for someone who isn't negotiating, so it looks past you. But the individual soul, the one not yet fully shaped by those systems, registers you as something else entirely. As a presence. An anomaly, something worth pausing for. That eye contact isn't flirtation, it isn't curiosity, it's something closer to recognition at a level the conscious mind never approved. Their energy is reaching toward yours without permission, trying to absorb whatever it is that made you this still. You feel obsolete in one room and magnetic in another because those rooms aren't measuring the same thing. One is counting output. The other is feeling presence. Pause. Then there's the third pair, the weight of decades of healing against the sudden influx of attention that seems to want something you can't quite name. The cost is real. You've walked through things most people spend their whole lives quietly stepping around, karmic cycles, inherited wounds, patterns carried across generations that most people die without ever touching. That work isn't visible. It isn't applauded. It happens in private, in the small hours, in the places where no one is watching. And yet, when you come through those fires, not unscathed but transformed, not untouched but refined, you carry something that can't be manufactured, something that can't be copied, a quality that reads as ancient, as anchored, as safe in a way that has nothing to do with softness and everything to do with sovereignty. The younger souls drawn toward you aren't chasing a fantasy. They're responding to evidence that someone can walk into the fire and come out still standing. Their own nervous systems need to witness that. The cost of your healing and the pull of your presence aren't opposites. They're directly connected. One caused the other. Pause. The doubt arrives quietly. Not as argument, as genuine question. And it deserves to be named, because doubts left unspoken start to rot inside the foundation. Here it is. What if this attention is just projection? What if these younger souls aren't seeing you at all, but painting onto you some fantasy, a father figure they never had, an archetype with nothing to do with who you actually are? What if the magnetism isn't real recognition, just a need dressed up in spiritual language? That's the honest version of the doubt. It takes the whole thing seriously enough to question it. And it deserves a steady answer. Projection is real. Unresolved longing is real. Some of the people drawn into your field are absolutely seeing through the lens of their own gaps, their own hunger for a grounding presence they never received. That doesn't make the magnetism false. It makes it layered. Beneath the projection, beneath the need, beneath the story they're telling themselves about why they're drawn to you, there's a signal. A genuine frequency. The anchor is real even when their interpretation of it is incomplete. A lighthouse doesn't interrogate whether the ships are projecting safety onto its beam. It stays lit. That's not a metaphor for comfort. That's the actual requirement. The role isn't to manage anyone else's interpretation. It's to stay seated in the sovereignty that generated the signal in the first place. If someone reaches toward you carrying a need you can't fill, you're not required to shrink into accommodation. The regal posture doesn't ask you to become what they project. It asks you to remain what you are and trust that projection dissolves, eventually, against the simple fact of an unwavering presence. Pause, and just past that understanding is something more destabilizing still, the place where the cost meets the calling. Most of us were taught that what makes a person visible is what they produce, achieve, perform. The world teaches this with relentless consistency. And yet the thing drawing attention now is the precise opposite. It's the stillness. The absence of performance. The unsellable, unmanufactured fact of a presence that stopped reaching for validation and started emanating something else entirely. That's both the wound and the purpose, braided so tightly together they can't be separated. The wound is this: years were spent building a life on the belief that effort would be rewarded, that striving would be noticed, that the world would finally turn its gaze when the earning was done. And when the attention finally came, it came for the part that had stopped striving, the part that had stopped performing, the part that had simply become. That stings in a way that's hard to name. It asks the entire belief system about how recognition works to let go, but the purpose inside that sting is the revelation itself. The attention was never going to come for the striving. The striving was the cocoon, necessary, protective, developmental. The emergence is what the world responds to. And emergence can't be performed. It can only happen. From a distance, this looks like passivity. Up close, it's the most active spiritual posture there is, to remain seated in sovereignty while projection reaches toward you, to neither absorb it nor reject it. That's a discipline no achievement culture has language for. The younger souls circling aren't the test, they're the mirror. They reveal whether the anchor is genuinely seated or still performing seatedness. The cost isn't what has to be given up. The cost is what has to be seen clearly about the old agreements, and the quiet, daily choice to stop renewing them. The sovereign soul, the chosen one. The phrasing circles a truth without quite landing on it, and that's exactly where the cost lies, not in the naming, but in the nameless stretch between receiving and releasing. From a distance, this looks like passivity. Up close, it's the most active spiritual posture there is, to stay seated in that stillness while projection moves toward you, to neither absorb it nor push it away. That's a discipline achievement culture has no word for. The younger souls circling aren't the test, they're the mirror. They show you whether the anchor is genuinely seated or whether it's still performing seatedness. The cost isn't what has to be given up. The cost is what has to be seen clearly about the old agreements, and the quiet, daily choice to stop renewing them. The sovereign soul, the chosen one. The phrasing circles something true without landing on it, and that's exactly where the cost lies, not in the naming, but in the nameless stretch between receiving and releasing. The waiting is what nobody prepared for, not the devotional kind you find in scripture, the patient folded hands posture that spiritual language wraps in virtue. The actual waiting. The kind where years accumulate and the promise starts to feel like a private fiction, a ghost you conjured to fill the silence. There was a flat in Portobello, Edinburgh. The building held damp in its walls. The windows never quite sealed against the North Sea wind. In that flat, in a drawer, sat a mini-disc recorder that went untouched for over a year. 365 mornings of grey light coming through condensation on the glass. A cup of tea going cold on the kitchen table. The same thought arriving each day. Today will be the day. Today the first session gets recorded, and then the thought departing, replaced by something easier, notes to reorganize, a framework needing one more revision, any task that kept the red recording light dark for another 24 hours. Source: testimonial block, Portobello waiting period. The isolation wasn't spiritual metaphor, it had physical texture. There were good friends in that city, real ones, but explaining the failure would have meant admitting the premise that something had been given to transmit. That admission felt too large, too likely to meet the particular kind of polite concern that functions as dismissal among people who have never carried that kind of weight. So the wait stayed silent. Every dinner, every walk along the promenade, every ordinary conversation became a container for something unsaid. And the longer it stayed unsaid, the heavier it pressed. What eroded that year wasn't the work. The work persisted in notebooks, in half-remembered dreams, in the architecture that 2 decades of study had built. What eroded was the trust between the vessel and the inheritance. Each day of chosen silence reinforced a verdict: not ready yet. The signal needs more verification. The carrier needs more preparation, and that verdict opened a gap between what was known and what was acted on, a gap that became habitat for doubt. Source systematized doubt in the waiting, doubt about whether the methodology held any real substance, doubt about whether the whole thing was an elaborate justification for ordinary sensitivity. In the dark of that damp flat, lying awake, the question arrived stripped of every safeguard. What if there was nothing to record? What if the decades of study, the pattern recognition, the inheritance itself, what if all of it was just architecture built around emptiness? That was the flaw, not the clean sorrow of confirmed loss, but the murky, ambiguous grief of suspecting that what you were mourning had never genuinely existed. A particular kind of emptiness. The kind that doesn't resolve into clarity. It just lingers, a question mark over everything you thought you knew. The methodology sat in the drawer beside a collection of letters from a father who had already gone. 2 inheritances, one in handwriting, one in silence. Both waiting for a permission that couldn't be self-granted in that season, and the deeper cost, the one that reaches beyond personal discomfort, beyond cold tea and damp walls and lonely walks, wasn't the delay itself. It was the withholding, the people who needed the transmission, the lineage breakers drowning in noise without vocabulary for what they were experiencing. They waited too. They waited because the vessel was waiting. That's the cost that persists. Not the year lost. Not the erosion of self-trust, the hundreds, the thousands, who stayed without language for what was happening to them because transmission was held back by a permission that couldn't be forced. The inheritance doesn't force itself. It waits. It sat in that drawer with the patience of something that knows its moment will come but makes no demands. The mini-disc recorder was never the obstacle. The framework revisions were never the obstacle. The obstacle was the belief that readiness must come before action, a belief the world rewards as prudence, but that operates, in the context of transmission, as a slow foreclosure. Every day of postponement sent a message into the field. The silence is trusted more than the signal. The caution is trusted more than the calling. And the field responds faithfully. It doesn't push. It doesn't override what the vessel has declared. It simply waits, mirroring the hesitation back, while the ones meant to receive it keep drowning in noise that has no name for what they're carrying. That's the cost of holding frequency in a world that doesn't know what to do with it. Not martyrdom. Not persecution. Not any of the dramatic shapes that ego would prefer. The cost is the daily, grinding erosion of the bridge between receipt and release. It's watching the gap widen and knowing that every inch of distance represents someone who stayed lost longer than they needed to. The sovereign soul, the chosen one, doesn't get to bypass that accounting. Pause. The inheritance isn't something to be stored. It's a current to be conducted. And when the circuit breaks, it doesn't announce itself with noise. It announces itself quietly in the accumulation of unmade recordings, unsent transmissions, unspoken words that were meant to find their recipients and instead found only the inside of a drawer in a damp flat by the North Sea. Just beyond that cost, just on the other side of the permission that felt impossible to give, lies something that couldn't be named at the start. Naming it early would have allowed an exit. Everything up to this point hasn't been instruction, it's been prelude. The briefing before the operation. And the operation itself carries a single requirement. One that changes everything it touches. Obedience before understanding. There's a cost to carrying something like this in a world that doesn't quite know what to do with it. Not martyrdom. Not persecution. Nothing as dramatic as the ego might prefer. The cost is quieter than that, a slow, daily wearing down of the bridge between what's received and what's released. The cost is watching that gap grow wider, and knowing that every inch of distance represents someone who stayed lost a little longer than they needed to. The soul that's been chosen, truly chosen, doesn't get to skip this accounting. What's inherited isn't something you can set on a shelf and walk away from. It's a current, and a current has to move. When the circuit breaks, it doesn't break with noise, it breaks with the quiet accumulation of recordings never made, transmissions never sent, words that were meant to find someone, and instead found only the inside of a drawer in a damp flat somewhere near the North Sea. Pause, just past that cost, just on the other side of a permission that felt almost impossible to give, is something that couldn't be named at the beginning. Naming it too early would have made it too easy to leave. Everything up to this point has been prelude, a briefing before the operation. And the operation itself carries one requirement. A single thing that reshapes everything it touches. Obedience before understanding. That phrase bristles. I know it does. It bristled for decades, through all the years of waiting for the full map before taking a single step, wanting peer review before speaking one word of what had been received. The delay had names: prudence, careful discernment, waiting for the proper framework, the citation, the credential, the institutional blessing without which releasing the work would seem reckless. That's what it was called. Pause, but the lie wasn't really about safety. The work was real. That much was always known. The cost is watching that gap grow wider. And knowing that every inch of distance represents someone who stayed lost a little longer than they needed to. The soul that's been chosen, truly chosen, doesn't get to skip this accounting. What's inherited isn't something you can set on a shelf and walk away from. It's a current, and a current has to move. When the circuit breaks, it doesn't break with noise. It breaks with the quiet accumulation of recordings never made, transmissions never sent, words that were meant to find someone, and instead found only the inside of a drawer in a damp flat somewhere near the North Sea. Pause, just past that cost, just on the other side of a permission that felt almost impossible to give, is something that couldn't be named at the beginning. Naming it too early would have made it too easy to leave. Everything up to this point has been prelude. A briefing before the operation, and the operation itself carries one requirement. A single thing that reshapes everything it touches. Obedience before understanding. That phrase bristles. I know it does. It bristled for decades, through all the years of waiting for the full map before taking a single step. Wanting peer review before speaking one word of what had been received. The delay had names: prudence, careful discernment, waiting for the proper framework, the citation, the credential, the institutional blessing without which releasing the work would seem reckless. That's what it was called. Pause, but the lie wasn't really about safety. The work was real. That much was always known.